One winter's evening, near the close of the year 1800, or within a year or two of that time, a young medical practitioner, who had recently set up in business, was sitting by a cheerful fire in his small parlor. He listened to the wind as it drove the rain in pattering drops against the window or rumbled dismally in the chimney. The night was wet and cold. He had been trudging through mud and water all day and was now resting comfortably in his dressing gown and slippers, more than half asleep and less than half awake, turning over 1,000 matters in his wandering imagination. First, he thought how fiercely the wind was blowing and how the cold, sharp rain would at that moment be beating on his face if he were not safely housed at home. Then his mind drifted to his annual Christmas visit to his native place and his dearest friends. He thought how delighted they would all be to see him, and how happy it would make Rose if he could only tell her that he had finally found a patient, that he hoped to have more, and that he could come down again in a few months, marry her, bring her home to brighten his lonely fireside, and spur him to fresh efforts. Then he began to wonder when his first patient would appear, or whether he was destined by some special act of providence never to have any patients at all. Then he thought of Rose again, dropped off to sleep, and dreamed of her until the sound of her sweet, merry voice rang in his ears and her soft, tiny hand rested on his shoulder. There was a hand on his shoulder, but it was neither soft nor tiny. Its owner was a stout, round-headed boy who, for the sum of 1 shilling a week plus his food, was hired out by the parish to carry medicines and messages. Since there was no demand for medicines and no need for messages, he usually spent his idle hours, averaging 14 a day, in sneaking peppermint drops, eating animal food, and sleeping. "A lady, sir, a lady," whispered the boy, shaking his master awake. "What lady?" cried our friend, sitting up, not quite sure his dream had been an illusion and half hoping it might be Rose herself. "Where, lad?" "There, sir," replied the boy, pointing to the glass door leading into the surgery with an expression of alarm that the very unusual sight of a customer might well have caused. The surgeon looked toward the door and started himself for a moment on seeing the appearance of his unexpected visitor. She was a remarkably tall woman, dressed in deep mourning, standing so close to the door that her face almost touched the glass. The upper part of her figure was carefully wrapped in a black shawl, as if for concealment, and her face was hidden by a thick black veil. She stood perfectly erect, her figure drawn up to its full height. Though the surgeon felt that the eyes beneath the veil were fixed on him, she stood completely motionless and showed no gesture whatsoever to indicate she was aware he had turned toward her. "Do you wish to consult me?" he asked hesitantly, holding open the door. It opened inward, so the action did not change the figure's position, which remained motionless on the same spot. She slightly inclined her head in acknowledgement. "Please walk in," said the surgeon. The figure moved a step forward, then turned its head toward the boy, to his infinite horror, and seemed to hesitate. "Leave the room, Tom," said the young man to the boy, whose large round eyes had been stretched wide throughout this brief exchange. "Draw the curtain and shut the door." The boy drew a green curtain across the glass part of the door, retreated into the surgery, closed the door behind him, and immediately pressed one of his large eyes to the keyhole on the other side. The surgeon pulled a chair up to the fire and motioned the visitor to a seat. The mysterious figure slowly moved toward it. As the blaze shone on the black dress, the surgeon noticed that the hem was soaked with mud and rain. "You are very wet."
"I am,"
said the stranger in a low, deep voice. "And you are ill," added the surgeon compassionately, for her tone was that of someone in pain. "I am," was the reply. Very ill, not bodily but mentally. It is not for myself or on my own behalf that I come to you," continued the stranger. "If I suffered from bodily disease, I would not be out alone at such an hour or on such a night as this. And if I were afflicted with it 24 hours from now, God knows how gladly I would lie down and pray to die. It is for another that I beg your aid, sir. I may be mad to ask it for him. I think I am. But night after night, through the long, dreary hours of watching and weeping, the thought has been constantly before my mind. And though even I see the hopelessness of human assistance availing him, the mere thought of laying him in his grave without it makes my blood run cold." A shudder, such as the surgeon well knew art could not produce, trembled through the speaker's frame. There was a desperate earnestness in this woman's manner that touched the young man's heart. He was young in his profession and had not yet seen enough of the miseries daily presented to its members to have grown relatively callous to human suffering. He said, rising hastily, "The person you speak of is in as hopeless a condition as you describe. Not a moment is to be lost. I will go with you instantly. Why did you not obtain medical advice before?" "Because it would have been useless before. Because it is useless even now," replied the woman, clasping her hands passionately. The surgeon gazed for a moment at the black veil, as if to discern the expression of the features beneath it. But its thickness made that impossible. "You are ill," he said gently, "though you do not know it. The fever that has enabled you to bear, without feeling it, the fatigue you have clearly undergone, is burning within you now. Put this to your lips," he continued, pouring out a glass of water. "Compose yourself for a few moments. Then tell me as calmly as you can what disease the patient has and how long he has been ill. When I know what I need to know to make my visit useful to him, I am ready to accompany you." The stranger lifted the glass of water to her mouth without raising the veil, put it down again untasted, and burst into tears. "I know," she said, sobbing aloud, "that what I say to you now seems like the ravings of fever. I have been told so before, less kindly than by you. I am not a young woman, and they say that as life steals on toward its final close, the last short remnant, worthless as it may seem to all beside, is dearer to its possessor than all the years that have gone before, connected though they may be with the memory of old friends long since dead and young ones. Children, perhaps, who have fallen away from and forgotten one as completely as if they had died too. My natural term of life cannot be many years longer, and should be dear on that account. But I would lay it down without a sigh, with cheerfulness, with joy, if what I tell you now were only false or imaginary. Tomorrow morning he of whom I speak will be, I know it, though I would fain think otherwise, beyond the reach of human aid. And yet tonight, though he is in deadly peril, you must not see him and could not serve him." "I am unwilling," said the surgeon after a short pause, "to increase your distress by commenting on what you have just said, or appearing eager to investigate a subject you are so anxious to conceal. But there is an inconsistency in your statement that I cannot reconcile with probability. This person is dying tonight, and I cannot see him when my assistance might possibly avail. You fear it will be useless tomorrow, and yet you would have me see him then. If he is indeed as dear to you as your words and manner imply, why not try to save his life before delay and the progress of his disease make it impossible?" "God help me," exclaimed the woman, weeping bitterly. "How can I expect strangers to believe what appears incredible even to myself? You will not see him then, sir," she added, rising suddenly. "I did not say I decline to see him," replied the surgeon. "But I warn you that if you persist in this extraordinary procrastination and the individual dies, A fearful responsibility rests with you. The responsibility will rest heavily somewhere, replied the stranger bitterly. Whatever responsibility rests with me, I am content to bear and ready to answer. As I incur none, continued the surgeon, by agreeing to your request, I will see him in the morning if you leave me the address. At what hour can he be seen? 9, replied the stranger. You must excuse my pressing these inquiries, said the surgeon. But is he in your charge now? He is not, was the rejoinder. Then, if I gave you instructions for his treatment through the night, you could not assist him. The woman wept bitterly as she replied, I could not. Finding little prospect of obtaining more information by prolonging the interview and anxious to spare the woman's feelings, which, subdued at first by a violent effort, were now irrepressible and most painful to witness, the surgeon repeated his promise to call in the morning at the appointed hour. His visitor, after giving him directions to an obscure part of Walworth, left the house in the same mysterious manner in which she had entered it. It will be readily believed that so extraordinary a visit made a considerable impression on the young surgeon's mind, and that he speculated a great deal, to very little purpose, on the possible circumstances of the case. Like most people, he had often heard and read of singular instances in which a premonition of death at a particular day or even minute had been felt and fulfilled. At one moment, he was inclined to think this might be such a case, but then it occurred to him that all the anecdotes of that kind he had ever heard were of people who had been troubled by a foreboding of their own death. This woman, however, spoke of another person, a man, and it was impossible to suppose that a mere dream or delusion would make her speak of his approaching dissolution with such terrible certainty as she had spoken. Could it be that the man was to be murdered in the morning, and that the woman, originally a consenting party bound to secrecy by an oath, had relented and, though unable to prevent some outrage on the victim, had decided to try to prevent his death by the timely intervention of medical aid? The idea of such things happening within 2 miles of the metropolis seemed too wild and preposterous to be entertained beyond the instant. Then his original impression that the woman's intellects were disordered recurred, and as it was the only way to solve the difficulty with any satisfaction, he stubbornly made up his mind to believe she was mad. Certain misgivings on this point, however, crept into his thoughts and presented themselves again and again through the long, dull course of a sleepless night, during which, despite all his efforts to the contrary, he could not banish the black veil from his disturbed imagination. The back part of Walworth, at its greatest distance from town, is a straggling, miserable place enough even today, but 35 years ago, most of it was little better than a dreary wasteland inhabited by a few scattered people of questionable character, whose poverty prevented them from living in any better neighborhood, or whose pursuits and lifestyle made its solitude desirable. Very many of the houses that have since sprung up on all sides were not built until some years later, and the great majority even of those sprinkled about at irregular intervals were of the rudest and most miserable description. The appearance of the place through which he walked in the morning was not calculated to raise the young surgeon's spirits or to dispel any anxiety or depression that the singular visit he was about to make had awakened. Striking off from the high road, his way lay across a marshy common through irregular lanes, with here and there a ruinous, dismantled cottage fast falling to pieces with decay and neglect. A stunted tree or a pool of stagnant water, roused into sluggish action by the heavy rain of the previous night, skirted the path occasionally. Now and then a miserable patch of garden ground, with a few old boards knocked together for a summer house and old palings imperfectly mended, with stakes stolen from neighboring hedges, bore witness at once to the poverty of the inhabitants and the few scruples they had about taking other people's property for their own use. Occasionally a filthy-looking woman would appear from the door of a dirty house to empty the contents of some cooking utensil into the gutter in front, or to scream after a little slip of a girl who had managed to stagger a few yards from the door under the weight of a sallow infant nearly as big as herself. But scarcely anything was stirring around, and so much of the landscape as could be faintly traced through the cold, damp mist hanging heavily over it presented a lonely and dreary appearance, perfectly in keeping with the objects just described. After plodding warily through the mud and mire, making many inquiries for the place he had been directed to, and receiving as many contradictory and unsatisfactory replies in return, the young man finally arrived before the house that had been pointed out to him as his destination. It was a small, low building, 1 story above the ground, with an even more desolate and unpromising exterior than any he had yet passed. An old yellow curtain was closely drawn across the upstairs window, and the parlor shutters were closed but not fastened. The house was detached from any other, and, as it stood at an angle of a narrow lane, there was no other habitation in sight. When we say that the surgeon hesitated and walked a few paces past the house, before he could bring himself to lift the knocker, we say nothing that need raise a smile on the face of the boldest reader. The police of London were a very different body in those days. The isolated position of the suburbs, when the rage for building and the progress of improvement had not yet begun to connect them with the main body of the city and its environs, made many of them, and this one in particular, a place of resort for the worst and most depraved characters. Even the streets in the gayest parts of London were imperfectly lighted at that time, and such places as these were left entirely to the mercy of the moon and stars. The chances of detecting desperate characters or tracing them to their haunts were thus very few, and their offenses naturally grew bolder as the consciousness of comparative security became more impressed upon them by daily experience. Added to these considerations, it must be remembered that the young man had spent some time in the public hospitals of the metropolis, and though neither Burke nor Bishop had yet gained horrible notoriety, his own observation might have suggested to him how easily the atrocities to which the former has since given his name might be committed. Be that as it may, whatever reflection made him hesitate, he did hesitate. But being a young man of strong mind and great personal courage, it was only for an instant. He stepped briskly back and knocked gently at the door. A low whispering was audible immediately afterward, as if someone at the end of the passage were talking stealthily with another on the landing above. It was followed by the noise of a pair of heavy boots on the bare floor. The door chain was softly unfastened, the door opened, and a tall, ill-favored man with black hair and a face, as the surgeon often declared afterward, as pale and haggard as the countenance of any dead man he had ever seen presented himself. "Walk in, sir," he said in a low tone. The surgeon did so, and the man, having secured the door again with the chain, led the way to a small back parlor at the end of the passage. "Am I in time?" "Soon," replied the man. The surgeon turned hastily around with a gesture of astonishment, not unmixed with alarm, which he found impossible to suppress. "If you step in here, sir," said the man, who had clearly noticed the action. "If you step in here, sir, you won't be detained 5 minutes, I assure you." The surgeon at once walked into the room. The man closed the door and left him alone. It was a small, cold room with no other furniture than 2 deal chairs and a table of the same material. A handful of fire, unguarded by any fender, was burning in the grate, which brought out the damp, if it served no more comfortable purpose, for unsightly moisture was stealing down the walls in long, slug-like tracks. The window, which was broken and patched in many places, looked into a small enclosed piece of ground almost covered with water. Not a sound was to be heard either inside or outside the house. The young surgeon sat down by the fireplace to await the outcome of his first professional visit. He had not been in this position many minutes when the noise of some approaching vehicle caught his ear. It stopped. The street door was opened. Low talking followed, accompanied by a shuffling noise of footsteps along the passage and on the stairs, as if 2 or 3 men were carrying some heavy body to the room above. The creaking of the stairs a few seconds later announced that the newcomers, having completed their task, whatever it was, were leaving the house. The door was closed again, and the former silence returned. Another 5 minutes passed, and the surgeon had decided to explore the house in search of someone to whom he could explain his errand, when the room door opened and his last night's visitor, dressed exactly the same, with the veil lowered as before, motioned him to advance. The singular height of her form, together with her not speaking, made the idea cross his mind for an instant that it might be a man disguised in women's clothing. The hysterical sobs that came from beneath the veil and the convulsive, grieving attitude of the whole figure, however, at once exposed the absurdity of the suspicion, and he quickly followed. The woman led the way upstairs to the front room and paused at the door to let him enter first. It was sparsely furnished with an old deal box, a few chairs, and a tent bedstead without hangings or cross rails, covered with a patchwork counterpane. The dim light coming through the curtain, he had noticed from outside, made the objects in the room so indistinct, and gave them all such a uniform hue, that he did not at first notice the object on which his eye had once rested. Then the woman rushed frantically past him and threw herself on her knees by the bedside. Stretched on the bed, closely wrapped in a linen wrapper and covered with blankets, lay a human form, stiff and motionless. The head and face, which were those of a man, were uncovered except for a bandage that passed over the head and under the chin. The eyes were closed. The left arm lay heavily across the bed, and the woman held the passive hand. The surgeon gently pushed the woman aside and took the hand in his. "My God," he exclaimed, letting it fall involuntarily. "The man is dead." The woman started to her feet and beat her hands together. "Oh, don't say so, sir," she exclaimed with a burst of passion amounting almost to frenzy.
"Oh, don't say so, sir. I can't bear it."
Men have been brought back to life before when unskillful people have given them up for lost, and men have died who might have been restored if proper means had been used. Don't let him lie here, sir, without one effort to save him. This very moment life may be passing away. Do try, sir. Do, for heaven's sake." While speaking, she hurriedly chafed first the forehead, and then the breast of the senseless form before her, then wildly beat the cold hands, which, when she stopped holding them, fell listlessly and heavily back onto the coverlet. "It is no use, my good woman," said the surgeon soothingly, as he withdrew his hand from the man's chest. "Stay, undraw that curtain." "Why?" said the woman, starting up. "Undraw that curtain," repeated the surgeon in an agitated tone. "I darkened the room on purpose," said the woman, throwing herself before him as he rose to undraw it.
"Oh, sir, have pity on me."
"If it can be of no use, and he is really dead, do not expose that form to any eyes but mine. This man died no natural or easy death," said the surgeon. "I must see the body." With a motion so sudden that the woman hardly knew he had slipped from beside her. He tore open the curtain, let in the full light of day, and returned to the bedside. "There has been violence here," he said, pointing toward the body and gazing intently at the face from which the black veil was now, for the first time, removed. In the excitement of a minute before, the woman had thrown off her bonnet and veil, and now stood with her eyes fixed on him. Her features were those of a woman of about 50 who had once been handsome. Sorrow and weeping had left traces on them that time itself would never have produced without their aid. Her face was deadly pale, and there was a nervous contortion of the lip and an unnatural fire in her eye that showed too plainly that her bodily and mental powers had nearly given way under an accumulation of misery. "There has been violence here," said the surgeon, keeping his searching gaze. "There has," replied the woman. "This man has been murdered, that I call God to witness." "He has," said the woman passionately, pitilessly, "inhumanly murdered." "By whom?" said the surgeon, seizing the woman by the arm. "Look at the butcher's marks and then ask me," she replied. The surgeon turned his face toward the bed and bent over the body, which now lay fully in the light of the window. The throat was swollen, and a livid mark encircled it. The truth flashed upon him suddenly. "This is one of the men who were hanged this morning," he exclaimed, turning away with a shudder. "It is," replied the woman with a cold, unseeing stare. "Who was he?" inquired the surgeon. "My son," rejoined the woman, and fell senseless at his feet. It was true. A companion equally guilty with himself had been acquitted for lack of evidence, and this man had been left for death and executed. To recount the circumstances of the case at this distant period would be unnecessary and might cause pain to someone still alive. The history was an everyday one. The mother was a widow without friends or money, and had denied herself necessities to provide for her orphan boy. That boy, unmindful of her prayers and forgetful of the suffering she had endured for him, the constant anxiety of mind and voluntary starvation of body, had plunged into a life of dissipation and crime. And this was the result: his own death by the hangman's hands, and his mother's shame and incurable insanity. For many years after this occurrence, when profitable and demanding occupations would have led many men to forget that such a miserable being existed, the young surgeon was a daily visitor at the side of the harmless mad woman. He not only soothed her with his presence and kindness, but also eased the harshness of her condition with generous financial donations for her comfort and support. In the brief moment of recollection and consciousness that preceded her death, a prayer for his welfare and protection, as fervent as any mortal ever breathed, rose from the lips of this poor, friendless creature. That prayer flew to heaven and was heard. The blessings he had helped to give were repaid to him 1,000-fold. Yet amid all the honors of rank and station that have since been heaped upon him, and which he has so well deserved, he has never forgotten the lesson of the black veil.